We'll look at the first job reports of this election year. Candidate Bloomberg has some thoughts on income inequality in America, and I'll have some thoughts on the cost of just about everything and its effect on our lives. Those stories and more as Labor This Week begins now. Hello, I'm Mark Harris, and the first jobs report of an all-important presidential election year is out, and it shows much of the same in terms of job growth for America. In fact, hiring increased last month with payrolls expanding by 225,000 jobs. Indeed, the economy has added jobs for 112 months straight. And this prompted President Trump to take to Twitter with glee and highlight the gains in his State of the Union address last week. Although most economists agree that the president inherited an economy that was already doing well for more than 6 straight years under President Obama. One indisputable fact, however, is that good paying and solid jobs in the manufacturing sector declined in January, extending a trend we have seen for some time now. The fact is that if you can say, would you like fries with that, there is a high likelihood that you can find employment near or at the minimum wage. But if you want to sell a skilled trade to the highest bidder, you might be out of luck. A fact borne out by the fact that wage growth has remained flat for low and middle income earners during the entirety of the recovery. Well-paid auto workers and miners gave up 12,000 jobs alone in January. Also hitting the skilled jobs market is the shutdown of the Boeing 737 MAX supply chain. The report also noted that the economy added 500,000 jobs less in 2018 and early 2019 than had been previously reported. This despite the promise of trickle-down growth from last year's tax cut. We'll be right back with some other news. In California this month, drivers who work for both Uber and Lyft have begun filing wage complaints. Why is that significant? Because in California, last year, the state legislature passed a new worker classification law known as AB 5, a law being watched closely around the country by other state legislatures that allows California workers to be classified as W-2 employees, thus giving them the right to be treated as workers employed by their companies and not as independent contractors, a classification that allows the drivers to file wage complaint laws against their companies, and significantly to form labor unions to protect worker rights and bargain with corporations for better working conditions, wages, and benefits. One of the catches with AB 5 is that it is not self-policing. The driver or a city attorney is required to file a complaint and wait for the Labor Commission to enforce the law. Not a quick or automatic process. And if that weren't enough, the National Labor Relations Board recently passed a law that says all app-based workers are indeed independent contractors. In fact, based on the recent board ruling, many app companies in California are refusing to recognize their drivers as anything but independent contractors, a fact they insist strips workers of their rights to file wage complaints at all. Now, this confusion has prompted Governor Gavin Newsom of California and some tech companies to begin working on some sort of legislative solution, with the Transport Workers Union fighting any attempt to take away app-based workers' new rights, found in the hopes of eventually organizing those workers. To be sure, this will be a widely watched issue in many states, and local and national politicians will be keeping a close eye. We'll be right back with some of the headlines making news this week. In Washington last week, the House finally passed the PRO Act aimed at protecting workers' rights to organize. Significant to the legislation is that it seeks to eliminate state right-to-work laws, among many other things. And more significant is that several Democratic House members drug their feet on this bill because they fear the pro-business lobby on the Hill. And as an aside, a few Republicans crossed over and voted in favor of the bill. And in the end, none of this matters because the bill will never see the light of day in the Republican-controlled Senate. Research now shows conclusively that raising the minimum wage or boosting the tax credit for working families in a state lowers the number of suicides in that state. Now, since 2000, the number of suicides in the U.S. has risen 35%, primarily because of significant deaths among the working class white population. Giving families more money to live on through the wage increases and tax credits relieves some of the deaths of despair we reported on a few weeks ago, which can be attributed to drug overdoses, suicides, and alcohol-related deaths. In a different study last year by the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, it was found that for every $1 increase in minimum wage, there was a 2% decrease in suicides. Workers at Instacart in Skokie, Illinois, have voted to unionize with the United Food and Commercial Workers Local 1546, and analysts say the victory sends a message to other gig workers around the country who might be fed up with working conditions at other Silicon Valley tech companies. The vote in favor of collective bargaining came despite the company's attempts to persuade the workers otherwise. Instacart workers pick and pack groceries in local stores for home delivery of grocery orders placed via the Instacart app. And billionaire presidential candidate Michael Bloomberg has written in the opinion pages of the New York Times that fixing income inequality is his priority. Bloomberg cites his track record of raising taxes on the wealthy when he was the mayor of New York by convincing the Republican-led legislature to raise taxes in order to alleviate the city's debt burden and create jobs for city workers. Bloomberg advocates raising taxes on the wealthy to help provide better education in public schools and better the lives of the middle class. Bloomberg also mentioned that he supports universal health care and supports taxing capital gains as ordinary income. Bloomberg's campaign has set their sights on March 3rd and the 14-state primary contest known as Super Tuesday to see if their strategies will play in the court of public opinion. I'll be back in a moment to talk about the crisis in affordability for most Americans. Writing in the Atlantic magazine, Annie Lowry crafts a compelling story about how the red-hot economy has bled most Americans dry. In the early 2010s, unemployment stood around 10%. It has now been hovering around 3.5% for quite a while. But pretty much anyone who wants to work can. Absent an education, though, or experience, or a marketable skill, those people will be working for close to or at minimum wage. Wages have increased dramatically over the course of the last decade for high-income earners, yet the vast majority of workers have been left behind. And in what Ms. Lowry calls the great affordability crisis, it's not so much the lack of increasing wages that have decimated families, but the cost of nearly everything they need to survive. The cost of affording a house is now only a pipe dream for most Americans. Upfront closing costs can now easily run over $100,000 in many locations. And the cost of a median homes in most expensive areas on both of the coasts is well over $1 million. And the idea of qualifying for a mortgage of that amount is almost impossible for most people. And even in areas of the country that might be considered more affordable, most homes are still out of reach for most people. The fact is that home prices are rising faster than wages in 80% of the American metro regions. And as to the over 20% of the country that they're not, well, good luck finding work that pays more than $7.25 an hour. So what is a person or a family to do if they can't afford a house? Well, they rent. And the story there, however, is much the same, with the costs of rents rising faster than wages for the last 20 years. Add to this the story that much of a family's wealth creation is tied to home ownership. And the story only gets worse as those with homes can sell and use the money in retirement or can even help finance their children's education, while those who can barely afford to rent are left with nothing in old age. But the crisis doesn't end with homes. Medical expenses continue to increase dramatically. And whether it be insurance or out-of-pocket deductibles, many people live one serious illness or accident from financial ruin. And 2/3 of all personal bankruptcies stem from a medical crisis in the family. And while we Americans pay fully twice as much for health care as citizens of other wealthy countries, our medical outcomes are no better. we pay twice as much and get the same results. Student loans. Student loan debt and the cost of college is a burden that is shaking families to the core, as parents who once felt a certain ability to afford college for their children watched their ability to save vanish, and the cost of college passed them by like they were standing still, leaving many parents racked with guilt and stealing from their own retirements to fund an education, only to become burdens on these same children later in life because their retirement savings are gone. And child care costs have risen 2,000% in the past 40 years. How can a young working couple, continue to work and continue to save under those conditions? Well, most can't. Housing, renting, medical care, child care, college are all now entirely out of reach for a middle class who once built this country into what it is and haven't had a raise in 50 years. The saddest part about this crisis is that it is policy driven by inept and scared elected officials who are loath to do the right thing in Washington for their constituents. Elected officials who are afraid to go against the wishes of their wealthy donors. And many of these problems could be fixed through responsible actions by our leaders, but they won't be as long as they fear wealthy campaign contributors more than they fear you throwing them out of office. Now, there's an election for the entire U.S. House of Representatives, for 1/3 of the U.S. Senate, and for the incumbent president coming this November. What will you do? I'm Mark Harrison. Have a good week, everyone.